It's the end of the last ice age. Our ancestors have survived this freezing desolation for 25,000 years. They are hunter-gatherers. They travel light, their children with them, one meal away from starvation. They are never able to settle down. But these nomads are about to change the world. Their Stone Age revolution will make our civilization possible. They will set humanity on the long journey to the modern world. Around 15,000 years ago, the climate began to change. The glaciers melted, and with water, the world came back to life. One of the best places for humans to live now was an area of the Middle East we call the Fertile Crescent, from Israel to Iraq. The hills were dotted with trees, which spread quickly as the weather improved. The open woodlands were like a garden, supporting a new range of edible plants. Animals flourished on the uplands and fertile plains. It was a hunter-gatherer's paradise. It was here that travelling bands found something completely new, which would change humanity forever. They discovered a huge family of plants, the grasses. It was a vast supply of grain. This was the spark which would make human progress possible. So Dorothy Garrett knew the Natufians were collecting the new grass foods in large quantities. At the same time each year, these ancient people would have found the ripening grass in huge areas. Many of them were not edible, but they managed to select all the useful species. Now they had barley and wheat. But they were travellers, working together in small family groups. They had to carry everything they harvested. This burden would ultimately change their way of life. Archaeologists estimate there were no more than 1,000 families living in the whole of Israel and Jordan at the time. There was enough grain to feed them well, and it was all growing wild.
Now, archaeologists have experimented in harvesting wild cereals in their natural area in the Middle East. And what they found is that one person harvesting for a period of about 3 weeks can produce enough food to feed a family of 4 for a whole year.
These ancient grasses are the forerunners of modern crops. The grains discovered by the Natufians still feed more than half the world's population today. Of all the things they ate, grain was unique in one vital way. It did not decay. Keep it dry, and it lasts for decades. For the first time, they had food they could rely on for long periods of time. Now, they needed to store their grain. There was a reason to stay in one place. This was the first time in the Middle East we know people built shelters to last from year to year. And they remained here from generation to generation down the centuries. While the Natufians would hunt anything, they were adept at catching large animals out on the range. They probably used the bola, with 3 stones connected by cords and thrown together, or the slingshot. Both were difficult to aim and throw accurately. They moved to the rhythm of the seasons and roamed for weeks at a time. Hunting was a dangerous way of life. They were vulnerable to injury, and their weapons were fragile. Their campsites show they worked constantly on repairs and making new tools. Like all Stone Age people, they relied on flint. By splintering different stones in the right way, they created an amazing range of specialized blades and axes. They had their own toolkits, which were precious and vital for survival. They are beginning to settle down near their own food supply. These early varieties of grain did not allow them to turn the flour into bread. Instead, a coarse biscuit combined different grains. A kind of pancake was the ancestor of today's flatbread. Skilled processing meant their teeth were not worn away by the coarse grain. They seem to have been clever about storage, although all the evidence has decayed. We know hollow gourds grew in the area, and they understood how to tan leather. The stored food must have been a treasure. It was a chance to share and celebrate and keep the clan together. It meant they could plan ahead and rely on the future. But stored grain was not enough to guarantee survival. The Natufians needed to combine their grain with seasonal foods like berries and nuts. They were instinctively creating a balanced diet. Fruit and vegetables with meat and starch. Inadvertently, they were directing the future evolution of plants, choosing the best, the biggest, the sweetest to carry home. It was the seeds of these carefully selected foods that ended up in the rubbish pile. The refuse was moist and organically rich, rather like a garden bed. The plants would sprout and cross-pollinate to create a more useful strain. These were the first experimental gardens. They traded or shared prized materials which helped to maintain a network of extended kin. This trade kept the wider Natufian culture together. It enabled their tools to travel throughout the region. They were experimenting with the beginnings of commerce. What's more, they swapped ideas, new tools, new decorations, and foods. But these meetings between clans had an even more fundamental purpose. Biological survival demanded they bring back new blood to the settlement. The huts took on a new meaning. They repaired them regularly. In these safe places, individual possessions could be secure. Here, people could make and keep ornaments and other personal possessions. The Natufian way of life continued for 2,500 years. Then suddenly, in less than 10 years, it all came to an end. The glaciers returned to Europe, trapping the Earth's fresh water in ice. The rest of the world became colder and drier. Scientists call this short ice age the Younger Dryas. In the Middle East, there was a vast drought. A great famine spread over the land. It was an environmental catastrophe. The Natufians were forced to abandon their settlements forever. Clans splintered into small groups, ranging desperately, nomadically, for food. Many perished.
It might have been like a sustained series of the worst droughts. The wild plant foods that these people relied upon just really weren't there anymore, and that it may have forced people back into a more mobile way of life.
Then the Natufians were offered one slim chance of survival. The drying Great Lake in Jordan exposed a fertile plain. It was here, on the shores of today's Lake Galilee, that a few Natufian refugees attempted to survive. Water, high in the hills, fed just a handful of natural springs that kept this new land moist and fertile. Now, the Natufians faced a profound challenge. They had abundant water. But these oases were very different from the rangelands and spaces they knew. What happened now is pieced together from the evidence of a number of sites in the Jordan Valley. It is a triumph of human adaptability. They knew this could never be a natural site for the huge grass colonies they once depended on. So they created their own miniature, controlled landscape. They dug the ground. They took their own precious food stocks and sacrificed them for the future. This simple act was the beginning of a new way of life. It would ultimately transform the face of the earth. They were the world's first farmers.
Late Natufian foragers had to adapt to new conditions.
The drought lasted for over 1,000 years. But then, in less than a generation, the ice age of the Younger Dryas ended. The world became wetter and warmer. At last, the weather was regular and reliable. Now it was perfect for farming. This was a moment which has occurred only a few times in the history of the human species. These farmers invented a whole new way of life. These early farmers at Zad were taking charge of evolution. They were mimicking natural selection and creating the first domesticated varieties.
One way in which the first cultivators may have selected would be by taking plants, which may have come from quite a long way away, and planting them and building up a population. Now they would choose, for example, a type of wheat which had a particularly large grain, which would give a high yield, or a barley which had, I don't know, a nice taste or something like that, and they bring these in and build up the population.
Now the cereals were so much more productive. But there was a downside. Crops had become a very serious and time-consuming business. A relentless chain of production, from harvesting to winnowing and grinding. It was very labor-intensive. Life was a lot less carefree. Storage had become a large enterprise. In fact, these farmers were the first to build specialized granaries. The first farmers still relied on hunting. The country around Zad was arid, and game was becoming scarce. They needed to improve the odds of hunting to bring down faster game at a distance. So they invented the bow and arrow. Perhaps they used it in human conflict, but there's not enough evidence to tell. In the long human journey, we can now finally say these farming people had settled down. They had a village, mud and rock houses with a door and a hearth built for a single family. They lived in a small community. They treated these huts as homes. Each year, they burnt the roofs to get rid of the bugs. The floors were leveled and remade. The scratched lines mark a quantity. This may be the first known record of a number. The biggest change created by farming is more children. A family could now feed lots of babies. After all, many hands make light work. For hunter-gatherers, it was just the opposite. They had to carry their small children on long treks. They had no more than they could manage. Now, farming families could support several generations to give the community a storehouse of wisdom. Inevitably, populations grew. More people, more farming, more food, more people. Humans were living on a larger scale than ever before. It was a huge challenge. People had to be organized. Now they needed leaders.
Once you have one biological viable entity living in one village, say 300-400 people living in the village, which means about, say, 100 families, and they don't move, there is naturally someone is going to become a chief, right? So you have the beginning of the emergence of social institutions, having the elders and maybe having a chief.
Far away to the north, another continent remained virtually unknown and unchanged by its human inhabitants. Across the vast expanse of Europe 9,000 years ago, a great forest stretched from the Black Sea to the coast of Brittany. Here, people still lived as they always had, hunting and gathering wild food, moving from place to place. Eventually, the revolution that began in the Fertile Crescent would spread across the rest of the world. Nearly all our ancestors would take up farming. But for most, it would not happen for many thousands of years. Unlike Europe, the climate of the Fertile Crescent produced abundant food all the way from Israel to Iraq. Here, the hunter-gatherers lived very well, and they had learned to hunt with dogs. Dogs have been sitting in the sun with people for at least 12,000 years. They're our oldest companions on the human journey. So close, we're not even sure whether we tamed them or they tamed us. Dogs were a part of life. The dogs were even more attracted to humans once they built huts.
Dog domestication comes with human sedentism, with people settling down and creating trash heaps and so on that are a lure and an attractant to the dogs. But it does set some sort of a precedent of bringing animals from the wild closer in to that human sphere of life.
The relationship with dogs must have set people thinking. Why not control other animals? It would provide a ready supply of meat and cut down on the hunting. The fireplaces of these hunters reveal the bones of goats, which were kept in herds. They were the very first domesticated farm animals. Today in the Middle East, people are still herding goats in the same way. The first herders selected smaller and less aggressive animals, removing the very trays the animals needed to survive in the wild. In return, the herders provided food and protection. they soon added other animals to their herds. This one small part of the world supplied almost all our domesticated species. For the herders, it was a brilliant idea. By keeping the animals alive and breeding them, they guaranteed the supply of meat.